Super exciting day today. This M30 BMW engine is gonna get its heads back. We're gonna button up the bottom end of this engine, then put the heads on and the intake as well today, hopefully. So let's button up that oil pan. First we need to go ahead and button up the oil pump on the bottom. We have to get our little chain on here and everything else. Tighten up these bolts and then go ahead and torque them to spec. Now, unlike the timing chain, this chain doesn't have any specific direction it has to be. It just runs the pump for the oil. So there's not really any way to mess this up. Then I just crank the engine over real quick to make sure that everything moves smoothly with no binding at all. And we're gonna flip this engine over, try it one more time. Now just the final torque on these bolts, and I'm gonna put that oil pan on. Once again, I'm gonna use the razor blade and some grease and everything else, and we're gonna clean off this surface as best we can. Toss the gasket on here. This is a nice thick gasket. It should hold for at least 5 or 10 minutes once this car starts running. It's a pretty big oil pan and it's very heavy, so you want to make sure that you get this gasket on there properly. Line it all up, and then it is time for the 187,000 bolts that go in and hold this thing on. Now there may very well be a specific torque order for these bolts. If there is, I'm pretty sure I don't know what it is. So I just kind of tighten down the bolts in the corners first, then we move all the way down the edges, and I tighten them up pretty tight the first time around. Then we take out our torque wrench and finish torquing them all up. Let's get the heads on here, and this is really exciting for me. One last go over of the head surface to make sure everything is perfectly cleaned. We of course want this to be just about as clean as we can possibly get it. So a little bit of last minute scraping and cleaning and wiping, and we toss our head gasket on there. And of course we want to make sure we get it in the proper direction. And there are water jackets in here that help to line up the head, so all you have to do is drop it on right over that. It should line up perfectly. Now we're going to put in the oil sprayer. This goes on right over top of the cam, and this is one of the problem points of this engine right here, are these banjo bolts right here, and they have little holes in them. They go in there and they allow the oil to feed up to the oil sprayer that sprays on top of the cams and everything else. You want to make sure you use Loctite to put these puppies on, because if you do not and they come out, your engine top end will not get oil and it will fail. So just Loctite these up, make sure you torque them to spec, and you should be just fine. And then we're going to use some Loctite on each one of the head bolts, and we're going to stick them in and hand tighten them in. And once we have all of our head bolts in, we are going to torque them in the specific manufacturer's recommended torque order for the very first time. When we do that, we are going to mark each of the head bolts to let us know that we did torque it the first time. Then there is a second torque procedure that you're going to go through, and I'm going to mark each of the head bolts for the second torque. Now there actually is a third torque sequence, that is an angle torque sequence, and we'll cover that when we actually get to the point where we're going to do it. But in order to do that, you need to first run the engine until it's at operating temperature, turn it off, let it cool down, and then do the final torque. So we've got a little time before we have to do that. Well, that was easy. Now we have the timing cover, and this is the point where we have to be sure the engine is timed up correctly so it's gonna run properly when we get it back together. Have I mentioned I've never done this stuff before? Honestly, I'm pretty nervous about it. So this is the timing chain guide, and there's only one way to put it on. It is keyed, so you cannot put it on improperly. However, you also have to make sure that the cam is put into the proper setting in order for us to be able to have this where we want it to be. So you can see a little bit of the harmonic balancer down on the bottom. It has a red line marked on it, which lines up with a mark on the timing cover, and that tells us that our bottom end is exactly where it's supposed to be in top dead center. On the camshaft, which is the thing that I'm trying to mount the sprocket on, you'll see a little hole at the very bottom of it. And that hole has to point to the same marks that your harmonic balancer are lined up to on the crankcase cover. And that tells you that your cam and your head is set properly at top dead center. So all you really have to do is rotate the chain around this until everything lines up with the keyhole so you can insert it in there. And when you do that, you know that that is lined up because the bolts on the sprocket that holds the chain will be parallel with the lower crankcase cover. So you've got your timing mark on your harmonic balancer and your timing mark on your cam, which should both point directly at the mark that is on the lower crankcase cover. And if you have that, your engine is perfectly timed. So you may just have to roll the chain around and move it along this sprocket until you get everything lined up so it'll slide on. And then we put the upper timing cover on. And now our top end is installed. Next, we have the distributor and some final attachments to the head, including that intake. Next, I'm going to go ahead and put this distributor together. This key goes in only one way, so you don't have to worry about not having it timed properly with your distributor key. There's only one way that you could possibly put it in there. Once you put it in, it just fits together with simple hardware. And of course, the distributor that I'm putting back on the car is completely brand new. It's a pretty simple procedure to put everything on here. It only goes on one way, so it's pretty much impossible to mess this up. We've got a couple of things to attach here on the back of the engine. And then we're going to move on to cleaning up our intake. We have to remove all the gasket material off of our intake so that it is ready to mate to our head surface. And I spent a whole heck of a lot of time cleaning this intake. The new intake studs need to go in before we can bolt this thing on. Now we had to put these studs in the head for our intake, and these are kind of interesting to put in. I didn't know exactly how to do it. I made sure to clean the head out using some of these wire brushes and that sort of stuff so that the bolts would go in properly. And basically you should be able to just hand tighten these in here pretty easily. Some people would probably say you should use Loctite. I did not on these particular bolts, I'm sure someone will let me know in the comments if I missed putting Loctite on there and should have. Now you could basically screw a nut onto these and then use a ratchet to ratchet them down. And once I did that, I put all the gaskets on and then put my intake on there. And there are lots of bolts that are very difficult to reach, as well as brackets that have to be attached to those bolts. And so this took quite a bit of time to get that intake on there. But eventually, when it's on there, you certainly do feel like you accomplished something. We are almost there. Just a few more bits to button up and this beast is ready. Now I'm going to mount on our thermostat housing. This has a bunch of sensors and everything else in it. It's one of the few things on the car that I didn't actually replace. I just left those sensors in and mounted it back onto the car. Attached some of the hoses which run to the water pump, and then we put the throttle body on our intake. Next I went ahead and put on our valve cover. It certainly does look pretty nice, completely refinished. I really like how that turned out. The last thing that I did was go ahead and put our exhaust manifold studs in there. So we are ready to bolt up our exhaust manifold. And I'm starting to get really excited about it. Wow, we got a lot done today. And it really didn't take as long as you might think. Once the parts were all in, it went back together in just a couple of afternoons. Boy, I can't shake that feeling that maybe I did something wrong though. I'm wondering if it's ever gonna run again. But it won't be long until I get to find out. Why do all this work on a BMW 733 that's not worth anything? Well, it could only be for the love of cars. And if this moron can do it, I know you can too. So find that beauty that you've always wanted and make it work again. I'll see you in the next one.